Hi everyone! It's great to see you again today. Are you ready to hear more from our story of John Newton?
Yeah, I'm totally!
Maybe you've seen beside us a large ship. Do you know what the largest ship in the world today is? Do you know, Charlie?
No, I don't know. What is it?
Well, it's called the Wonder of the Seas. And the ship is 5 times bigger than the Titanic was.
Oh, that's so big!
I know, it must be gigantic. The ship is so big, it's got 18 different decks. That means 18 different levels.
Whoa, that's extremely big. I could get lost in that ship.
I know, Charlie. Well, in today's story, we're going to hear how John ended up in another ship.
Did he stay on the ship?
Well, we're going to have to listen and hear and find out what happens next.
Can you remember what happened to John? That's right, John had tried to escape the Navy ship, but he was captured and he was brought back to the ship, and the captain had punished him, and he had been beaten and he'd been whipped. It was now 2 weeks later, and John's back was still red and sore. He spent hours lying in his hammock under deck. He refused to get up. John would lie there for hours on end, feeling sorry for himself. He was so far away now from England. He was so far away now from Polly, the woman that he loved. When would he ever see her again? When would he ever get back to England? How long was he going to have to stay on this ship? He was supposed to stay on this ship for 5 years. The thoughts of that filled John's mind with despair. He was so sad. And not only that, there were times when he would get really angry. There were times when he thought he could kill one of the officers, that he would even kill the captain himself. John went from being angry to being sad. He even thought about throwing himself over the side of the boat. But something stopped him from doing that. The other sailors didn't like him either. They would whisper about him, they would talk about him, because John was lazy and he was rude. John was no longer an officer, but he was now a common sailor just like them. And they just didn't like him. One morning after 3 weeks of sailing, John woke up and he could hear that some supplies were being loaded onto the ship below him. They had now stopped at the Canary Islands just off the African coast. They had stopped for supplies of fresh food and other things that they needed. Although John had heard the wake-up whistle earlier, he still was lying in his hammock. Then he could hear footsteps coming down from the upper deck to where he was. An officer was standing in front of him. "Get up now, Newton," he shouted at John. John muttered something under his breath and rolled around in his hammock. "What was that?" the officer said. "Don't be blaming me for where you are. Now get up." He then kicked the bottom of the hammock. John was still lying in the hammock, and he snarled at the officer. "I'll get up when I'm ready to get up, not whenever you tell me." The officer then cut the ropes of the hammock, and John was lying on the ground. "Get up now," the officer shouted at him. John knew that he was in trouble. He quickly scrambled up off the ground and got himself ready to go up on the deck. When he got up on the deck, there was a lot of activity going on, and he could see that there was one of the sailors, and he was loading his belongings onto a longboat to go to a merchant ship. John could see that in the distance. He went over to one of the sailors and he said, "Where's he going?" The sailor told him, "He's being traded off to a merchant ship. I hear that they're looking one more sailor to trade off." John had an idea. He thought to himself, "I could get off this ship. I could escape this ship. I could get onto that longboat." John then went up to one of the officers and was being very polite to him. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said. "Is it possible for me to be traded off onto that ship?" The officer looked back at him and snarled at him. "I'd hardly think anybody would want you. You're so lazy. We'd have to pay someone to take you. But on the other hand, it might be nice to get rid of you." The officer went off and asked Captain Catterell if John could be traded onto the ship. He came back and said that he could go, and so John quickly packed up his belongings and headed off to the ship. John had now been dismissed from His Majesty's service on the Navy ship. What was going to happen to John now? The captain of the ship was called Penrose, and he came over and he greeted John. He said, "I hear that your name is John Newton. Would you be related to Captain Newton of Wapping?" This was John's father. Was John anything like his father? No, he wasn't, but the captain didn't know that yet. Well then, the captain said, "I am just honoured to have you on this ship. Captain Newton is a dear friend of mine. Mr. Blunt will show you to your quarters." Mr. Blunt said to John, he said, "I do not share the captain's enthusiasm for having you on this ship. Anyone that's dismissed from His Majesty's service is unfit to be in this ship. I hope you prove me wrong," he said to John. John Newton did not prove Mr. Blunt wrong, because John was lazy and he did no work. He used every opportunity to do absolutely nothing, and he would curse and he would swear and he would drink just to try and impress the other sailors. Captain Penrose was not impressed at all, and as time went on he would get more and more annoyed with John. John would make up songs about the captain and get all the other sailors to sing them. He was so disrespectful. Captain Penrose suddenly got sick and died a few months later. Everything would now change for John, because Mr. Blunt was now captain of the ship, and he was not as nice as Captain Penrose. John knew this, and he knew that Captain Blunt would probably try and get rid of him as quickly as possible. There was another man on the ship, and his name was Amos Clow. John got to know this man, and Amos Clow offered him a job. Not only that, but he offered him a partnership in his business. But what was his business? He operated a factory. That's what it was called. But this factory was not a place where things were made. This factory was where people were treated like slaves. It was a terrible place. These slaves were chained up and given very little food. They were all from Africa. Amos Clow would sell these slaves to other places in the world, and he made lots of money from it. He was selling people. John heard these stories, and he thought that this was a great way for him to make money. That would mean that he could get back to England sooner and marry Polly if he had lots and lots of money. That's all John was thinking about. He was only thinking about the money. It didn't take long for John's dreams to disappear. When he got off the ship, he was taken to Amos Clow's house. But John got really sick, and Amos Clow had planned to go upriver to get more slaves. Well, John couldn't go. He had to stay in the house with Mr. Clow's wife, and her name was called Pye. Amos Clow said that he would be back, but he was gone for weeks. In that time, John was treated really badly by his wife. She treated him like one of her slaves. She only gave him a little water every day to drink, and he would eat only the leftovers from what the other slaves had eaten, and they didn't get much food either. John was not getting better. Instead, he was getting sicker and he was getting weaker. One day when he had a fever, he was so weak, he had been begging for food. Pye had given him a little bit of food on a plate, but because he was so weak, he dropped the plate. She shouted at him, "Is that what you do with the food I give you? Then you'll have no food," she shouted at him. John was left with nothing. He was starving. He was so weak and he was so ill. What was he going to do? That night, John was so hungry. He managed to slip out through the window of the house. His whole stomach was twisted up in pain because he was so hungry, and John was trying to search for some food out in the darkness. Then John spotted some cassava plants growing nearby. These plants were sometimes eaten when they had been heated up, but John was so hungry that he just began to dig into the ground with his fingers, and he began to dig up the roots, and he wasn't going to cook them. He was so hungry, he ate them raw. He ate these roots raw. Well, very soon, John began to feel even sicker. He was so sick that he began to throw up. John would have died from weakness, from sickness, from starvation, only for the other slaves. The other slaves didn't get much food, but they would keep a little bit for John, and they were feeding him, and they were trying to help him to get better. Eventually, John did get stronger, and he did get better. And during this time, John had also been writing letters to England. Letters of how he needed someone to come and help him, how he was in great danger. And the other slaves, they would take these letters and they would sneak them out of the house. And they would manage to get them posted. When Clive finally returned back, John told him about how badly he'd been treated. But he wasn't going to listen, especially when his wife was standing there. John was so glad that the next business trip was coming up that he would be able to go with Clive. But when he did, it ended up that Amos Clive treated him like a slave as well. John was accused of stealing by the other people on the boat, and Amos Clive had John chained up in the small boat and left there. He wasn't given any food. And John, he would try and drink the water out of the sea, and sometimes he would manage to catch a little fish. And that's what he ate. That's what he lived on. John continued to be treated as a slave by Amos Clive and his wife Pye. This went on and on and on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and John thought that he was losing his mind. Then Amos Clive decided to trade John off as a slave, and John was then traded off to a different person. This man also owned a factory in the area, and instead of treating John like a slave, he gave John a job. He fed him, he clothed him. John now was able to have some money, and he was feeling much better and looking much better. John was now given part ownership of part of the factory, and John was now making lots of money. But John had quickly forgotten his days as a slave, and he began to treat the slaves in the factory really, really badly. Remember, these people were chained up, they were given very little food, and then they were sold off. He would force them to do whatever he wanted them to do. But he also began to learn about the different false gods that many of these slaves worshipped. He would take part in rituals and worshipping these false gods. And very soon John gave no thought to the God of the Bible, the true and the living God. John seemed so far away from God. But John didn't realise that there was a plan to rescue him from this. Back in England, John's father had not forgotten about John, and he'd managed to receive these letters that John had written when John was very sick in Pye's house. He then sent a ship to where John was to rescue him. This ship was called the Greyhound, and John's father sent a captain to go on this ship and to find John and to bring him back to England. One warm February day, John was sitting on the porch of his nice house when one of his business partners came with 3 other men. And he pointed at John. He said, "Here's John. This is John Newton here," he said to the men. John was expecting this man to be someone who wanted to buy slaves from him. And the captain walked up to John and he said, "So you're John Newton? I've been looking for you," he said. "For me? What for?" John thought. John wondered, did he owe the man some money? "Your father has sent me to rescue you from England. There's a ship here ready to take you back." John stopped for a moment. He remembered all those letters that he had sent while he was a slave himself. But now he was making lots of money, and he laughed at the captain, and he said, "Rescue me? I don't need to be rescued. Tell my father I'm staying here. I'm not going back." John stood up, and quite rudely, he began to walk back into his house. "Hold there a minute, Newton," the captain said. "I have some news for you. Your father said that one of your aunts, a wealthy aunt, has died, and she's left you a large sum of money in her will." "What was that?" John turned and said. That was getting his attention. More money? That's exactly what John wanted. "You've inherited a fortune," the captain said. "I've been instructed to bring you home on this ship, the Greyhound." Well, John did not wait. Within an hour, he had everything packed up, and he was back on that ship, the Greyhound. He couldn't believe it. He was now going to be sailing back to England. He would have lots and lots of money. And not only that, he would be able to marry Polly, the love of his life. But in reality, it was too good to be true. In fact, it wasn't true at all. The captain had actually made this story up just to get John on the ship. There was no money. John was not going to have a large inheritance from an aunt. What would he do whenever he found out the truth? It didn't take long for the captain to see how lazy John was. Lazy, rude, He was drinking, he was swearing, and the more time spent on this ship with John, the more the captain disliked him. John would tell stories about the factory, about the way the slaves had been treated. John was so cruel, and the captain just thought so little of John. One day the captain said to John, "I'm no saint myself," he said to him, "but you're like a Jonah on this ship. I'm afraid no good will come to us on this ship while you're on board." After finishing their trading on the African coast, the ship then was heading back to England. But out on the Atlantic, the wind and the waves were wild. John was bored on this ship, and instead of drinking, he began to read books. There was one book that he picked up, and it was all about how if you lived a life devoted to God, you could have peace and joy in your life. John wondered about that. He thought about his own life and how he had tried so many different ways to have joy and to have peace and to have happiness, but he still didn't really have happiness. John thought to himself, I wonder, is this true? I wonder, is it really true? With that, John closed the book. He went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, he was awakened because they were now in the middle of a storm. He could hear cries from the deck. "The ship is sinking!" John began to panic. Was this the end? Is this how he would die? John jumped to his feet and climbed up the ladder onto the deck. The captain shouted at him. "John, go and get my knife from the cabin," he shouted. John turned back towards the ladder and began to climb down, and another sailor was climbing up the ladder. And he climbed up the ladder, and as John watched him, he went across the deck, and he was swept right over the side of the boat. John couldn't believe it. That could have been me, he thought. I could have been swept off the side of the deck, only for the fact that I was now starting to come down this ladder. That scared John. John realised how fragile his life was. But John's escape seemed only to be temporary, because this ship was battered by wave after wave after wave. How would they survive this storm? One section of the bow was completely destroyed, and the water was coming in everywhere. The sailors were frantically trying to get the water out of the ship. As the captain stood there looking at the hopeless situation, he said to John, "Did I not tell you that you were like Jonah? Maybe we'll have to throw you overboard," he said. Still, the crew, the sailors, the captains, all the different people in the boat battled hard to keep this ship from sinking. They worked for hours and hours through the night. "Grab any wood you can to patch up that hole," the captain shouted. "It's our only hope." It was their only hope? There seemed to be very little hope. John could only answer, "Lord, have mercy on us." What was going to happen to John? You'll have to wait till next time to find out.
That was an awful storm.
I know, Charlie. Maybe you've been in a storm before. I wonder what's going to happen to the ship. I wonder what's going to happen to everybody on board.
And what will happen to John?
Well, we're going to have to come back for our next episode of John Newton and find out what's going to happen next. See you then. Bye.
Bye.